This happened during the summer of 2012 when I was 15 and still an active member of the local Boy Scouts troop. I went camping, something my troop had frequently done. The camp we chose for a full weekend. It was a nice forested area with taller grass. It also lacked other campers. We saw no more cars driving in or out throughout the time we spent there. Since we did not have to worry about other campers, our troop had a big campfire on Saturday night that went late into the night. Eventually, our campsite started to die out, prompting us to put it out and head to our respective tents and hit the hay. Oddly for me, I was unable to sleep that night. I usually slept well on campouts, especially when I have the pleasure of using a tent alone. So I sat there in complete silence, listening to the various sounds around my tent. Eventually I found myself dozing off until I heard something walking nearby our campsite. There was a very apparent rustling of grass that began to get closer and closer to the blob tents that our boys were sleeping in. After a solid minute of movement, the sound stopped right in front of our tent. That was about 7 or so feet from mine. I then heard a rustling start up again and head off into the direction of the forest. I was paralyzed with fear. What could have made that sound? I thought about it for a solid few minutes and eventually decided it must have been an adult checking on us. Before I went to sleep, I looked out the little tent mesh window at the side of my tent and did not see anything out of the ordinary in our campsite. The sound went on for a bit in the distance, but I did not record for how long, as I eventually fell asleep. I woke up later that night to the same sound of rustling, yet this time it was close to our tent circle, as it was the first time I had heard it. While I did not think too much of this, I silently listened to the sound to see where it was headed, and once again it went to the same area it did the first time. Being curious, I peered through the tent window to see what was making the noise. My face turned white and I could not move. My mind was still trying to register what was going on. I saw a large black figure standing before the tent in the darkness, and it was clear it was not a scout, as the figure had no flashlight on and was far too large to be any boy or troop. Suddenly the figure inched their hand to the tent door and began to slowly unzip it. After what felt like several minutes, the figure seemed to poke their head into the tent. Immediately after, a deafening screech came from the tent. I heard other tents being unzipped and saw lights being flashed at the one tent, as well as a black figure starting to run away from the tent. Within seconds, the figure was running out of view into the line of trees. A few adults at the adult camp came to see the commotion. The boys who were in the tent told what they had experienced, and several boys mentioned that they had heard sound of rustling in the grass around our tents throughout the night. Unfortunately, none of them boys were able to get a clear view of the person, except the figure looked like a man and wore dark clothing. Disturbed, the adults had us move to the campsite where they were staying at, and 2 adults volunteered to stay awake for the rest of the night in case of the creep's return. The next morning we quickly packed our stuff and left as fast as possible. We warned the ranger in charge, who called the local sheriff. From what I know, the person was never caught, and our troop never camped there again. It was easily one of the most frightening experiences, and something I would always remember when I went camping during my time as a Boy Scout. The creepy man stalking my Boy Scout troop. Let's not meet again. So this was really before catfishing became a term we used, though the act itself has always been around as long as social media has. This was during my freshman year of college, and it was during the MySpace era. In college, I made friends with someone in my honors curriculum class, Leslie. She in turn introduced me many of her other friends, who then became my friends. They had all known each other for years, but were very welcoming to me, and I felt very much like a part of the group. That being said, I didn't really know them that well when this happened. What they did seemed, well, not like them. But then I realized I didn't exactly know what was like them. A member of the group, Catherine, is going away to school in Boston, and so the night before, we all decided to have a going away party of sorts. We were going to visit another friend, Tamara, who was going to school in Philadelphia, and then we were going to just have fun in the city. Our designated meeting space to drive down there was Dunkin' Donuts. When I got there, Leslie was there with our friends Samantha and Anthony, and Leslie looked pissed. She was sitting there with her arms crossed, kind of staring at nothing, but with an angry look on her face. As for Samantha and Anthony, they kept looking at the door, and they seemed both nervous and shifty. I could tell they were on edge. I sat down at the table of awkwardness, since we had to wait on Catherine and a couple of more friends, and things got awkward when no one was talking. Finally, I was just like, "What is the deal with you there?" Leslie replied, "You should ask them," gesturing to Anthony and Samantha. They suddenly looked guilty, but before they could answer, the door opened again, and they both went from looking guilty to anxious and mildly scared. I looked to the door and saw just a normal guy. When he walked in, he just kind of glanced around the room like he was looking for someone. Anthony and Samantha wouldn't say anything. Leslie just kept huffing and shaking her head. And all three kept looking over at this guy as he sat down. As soon as Catherine and the others got there, it was like we couldn't get out of there fast enough. Catherine, our friends Evan and Julie, and I were very confused. It was on the way to Philadelphia that we learned the truth. It was Leslie who told us. Apparently, Anthony and Samantha had created a fake MySpace account, and they had been catfishing this guy, Calvin. We didn't know the term catfishing yet, but that's what it was. They had created a fake account using a picture of an actress or singer or something. I can't remember. Only her face was obscured. Apparently this had been going on for a couple of weeks, and the conversations had gotten serious. Like Calvin seemed to really like this fake girl they had created. I didn't know why they did this, and when I asked them, they didn't really have a reason. Mostly, they were just bored. It turned out they had told him to meet at that Dunkin' Donuts at the time we were there. I think that once he showed up, Anthony and Samantha realized that this wasn't just a game, that Calvin was a real person with real feelings, and I do think they felt badly about what they had done. But it was too late. They couldn't take it back. There was no reason they had chosen Calvin. He was just some random guy they had picked. I guess Leslie had found out about it a couple of days prior and told them to end it. And that was why she was so angry at them. Because they had told her what had happened. That Calvin was supposed to be there. After that, I never really saw Anthony and Samantha in the same way. They weren't really people I wanted to be friends with, especially when I saw the messages and saw how much they had gotten Calvin to like him. I thought this could be the end of it. I was wrong. About a week later, everyone came to my house for pizza, and Samantha and Anthony told us that they had gotten messages from Calvin. I didn't think much of it because I already knew he had been messaging their fake account, wanting to know why she had stood him up. And he seemed upset, especially when this fake girl stopped replying. But no, that wasn't what Samantha and Anthony meant. He hadn't messaged the fake account. He had messaged their accounts. I remember them telling me that my sharp intake of breath, the way my heart rate increased, that unnerved me. The messages were more than the same. But also Calvin had made it clear he knew what they had done, and he seemed even angrier. Anthony, in particular, got a very long, furious message from Calvin. I don't want to say I thought they deserved it, but honestly, they had done a shitty thing, and there were some consequences. I figured it would die down in a couple of days. It didn't. A few days after Calvin had messaged Anthony and Samantha, he started messaging the rest of us who had been in Dunkin' Donuts that night. Now this really scared me. Keep in mind, I was already dealing with my other stalker situation. So I was understandably on edge, and this guy had found me. I did not know much about computers, but I thought he must have traced Anthony and Samantha's IP address or something since they'd used their own computers for the account. But when it came to the rest of us, we did not understand. How had he found us? My theory is that once he found Anthony and Samantha, he looked through their friends and recognized us from our pictures. But I don't know for sure. All of his messages came from MySpace, so at least he was texting us and stuff. But still, his messages were very angry. He kept saying things like, "How could you do this to me?" and "You made a fool of me. How dare you?" I thought about replying, but Evan had done that already, telling Calvin that we weren't responsible, and he didn't believe him. Honestly, Evan totally sold Anthony and Samantha out, but we figured that Calvin already knew they were the ringleaders. He just didn't know they were the sole perpetrators, instead thinking we all had a hand in it. I figured there was no point to defend myself since Calvin didn't believe Evan when he had tried. This went on for a couple of weeks, and it seemed like Calvin was getting increasingly angry the more we ignored him. Finally, I had had enough, and I was just like, "For God's sake." I replied and told him again that we weren't responsible, corroborating Evan's story. When I finally defended myself, Calvin messaged me back and said, "You made me into a fool, an idiot, and one day you'll know how that feels." I think you will. Maybe it was because of everything else that had happened with this guy, but that sounded like a threat. Like he was going to personally make sure I knew how we had made him feel. We were lucky. As far as I know, Calvin never did anything beyond messaging us aggressively. It could have been a lot worse. Eventually, Calvin stopped messaging us, and then he deleted his account. I felt bad for the guy, and Samantha and Anthony had been wrong. But what Calvin was doing to us was wrong too, the harassment. Eventually he stopped though, after a couple of months, and I never saw him again. I slowly drifted apart from the group. First Anthony and Samantha, for obvious reasons, then Catherine, then Julie, Evan, and Leslie. I wasn't too broken up about the first two, because they weren't the kind of people I really wanted to be friends with. Not only had they done a shitty thing, they had brought Calvin into our lives, like opening a door and inviting someone in. Around first grade, I had become friends with this kid named Stan. He was a couple of years older than I was, but he had a sister that was my age, who I was also friends with. I also had a wicked crush on their oldest brother, James. I lost contact with all three around middle school. Of course, when Facebook happened, I began getting in touch with people I'd gone to school with. It was a moderately sized kindergarten through 8th grade school, so you were basically with the exact same group of kids through each grade. This makes for some pretty strong bonds, I believe, because there's a lot of us who keep in contact after moving on to high school for a little while before drifting apart. Because of this, I was always really excited when I got back in touch with those people. However, not all of these connections have been positive. I got a friend request from Stan one day, under a different name. The messages were the typical, "How's it going? What have you been up to?" etc. Then he started sending messages that were about my looks. They weren't obscene, but they did make me a bit uncomfortable. He started pushing to meet me. I can't explain it, but I just had a really off feeling about him, so I would kind of avoid making any kind of plans. He continued to be pushy about things, and finally, I just stopped responding to his messages. I should also mention here that when I first accepted Stan's friend request, he literally went through every single one of my pictures and liked them. That should have been my first clue, but I just let it go. Then I started getting messages from friends and even some family members asking about him. Stan was going through and basically sending everyone friend requests. By this point, I'm like, what the hell? This is weird. But things got really nuts when my cousin informed me that Stan had not only tried to friend her, he'd also sent a message asking all sorts of questions about such things as I liked or places I liked to go. My cousin was concerned that I was sending those kind of messages to other people who might actually tell him what he wanted to know. I debated sending Stan a message telling him to back the hell off, but decided to just block him and change all of my Facebook settings to make it as private as I possibly could. I also sent out a mass message to every one of my friends and family informing them of the situation and to kindly not give out any of my personal information. I'd been friends with James, but ended up blocking him as well, just to prevent Stan from getting access to anything. Things got quiet for about a week, then the friend requests from random accounts started coming in. Some did not have pictures, some had random images. They were accompanied by messages that made it clear they were all from Stan. Full of skeevy comments on my looks and how he wanted to hook up. That's putting it mildly. Every day I had an account that needed to be blocked. I contacted Facebook about the situation, though that did not really offer any kind of help. It finally came to a stop when I threatened Stan with police intervention. The peace lasted for about 10 years. Then I got a friend request from a girl I'd also gone to school with named Kelsey. We talked pretty frequently both online and over the phone. She wanted us to hang out, so we talked about that some, but then she started bringing it up more frequently, persistently. I started to get that weird feeling again that something wasn't quite right. Then came the bombshell. Kelsey and Stan were dating. We'd all been in the same classes, so the fact that they knew each other wasn't strange, but for them to be dating? I confronted Kelsey about it and blocked her, but because we'd talked on the phone, they had my phone number. Of course, both began calling and texting crazy things non-stop. I finally had to get my number changed. It's been over 10 years since all of this, and I haven't heard from Stan once. Kelsey did try to friend me recently with a different account, and I looked through her Facebook shows. She's married to another man and no evidence of Stan. I'm not taking any chances though, so she's been blocked. So this happened when I was 9 years old during the summer. I grew up living with my parents and younger sisters, and our house was situated on a cul-de-sac. At the end of our cul-de-sac, there were a row of hedges with an opening at either end that led out to a huge field that had a tennis court, a playground, and a long pathway. This is relevant for later. Everybody that lived on our cul-de-sac knew each other pretty well. There were also a few kids my age, so I spent most of my free time playing outside on the grass with them. It's also worth noting that it was absolutely forbidden for any of us to venture out beyond the hedges without an adult, because our parents would not be able to see us from their houses. So one late afternoon, there were 5 of us sat on the grass chatting. It was pretty rare for someone that didn't live on the cul-de-sac to pass through, so it caught my eye when I saw a man making his way hurriedly along the pathway closest to my house. He had a scowl on his face and stared directly at us the entire time he was walking past. There was just complete silence between us until we walked through the hedge opening, and I could tell by the other kids' faces they too felt uneasy about him. We then immediately asked each other if anybody knew or had seen him before. None of us had. It was quickly forgotten about, and soon enough, each of our mothers had called us in for dinner. Around 10 minutes after we had finished dinner, I was in the kitchen helping my mom with the dishes. Our kitchen had a large window that faced out onto the grass outside, so I was taken aback when the same guy walked past again, in the same hurried manner, with the same scowl, this time staring directly into our kitchen. He had walked past. I gasped and told my mom that weird man was staring at us earlier. She looked up at him walking past, but didn't see anything until he immediately walked past in the opposite direction, again staring at us as he walked past. I yelled, "Mom!" and pointed straight at him. She saw him and ushered me out of the kitchen, saying something along the lines of, "Don't be silly. He's probably looking for someone." I went upstairs to get washed and ready for bed, the entire time feeling a bit freaked out by him. From then onward, I started spotting him at least weekly standing outside our local places, such as the post office, our local convenience store, etc. Each time I saw him, he was alone and not really ever doing much, just standing and looking around. I was always in my mom's car when I saw him. so I just ducked and kept out of his vision whenever I saw him. There were no more direct encounters, so I figured he was probably new to the area, and over time my nervousness of him lessened. Fast forward to winter. I was at school and playing on the playground during our lunch break. Towards the top end of the playground was a padlocked gate that was about 8 feet tall and about 4 feet wide. It was rarely ever used, so it caught my attention when my vision raced past the gate and I caught a shadow standing there. I did a double take, and it was the man. He was pressed right up against the gate with both hands leveled, with his head gripping the bars, staring straight at me. I freaked the hell out and started screaming and hysterically crying and made a run for it into the school building. One of the lunchtime supervisors, who also happened to live with her kids on our cul-de-sac, saw what had happened and took me straight into the nurse's office. The head teacher, along with a few other teachers, were called into the room and asked what had happened. I was too panicked to say anything outside of, "The man is out there." So the playground supervisor neighbor took over and explained to them. She said she had spotted him a few times on our cul-de-sac and had a bad feeling about him and had told her kids not to talk to him. The teacher went to another room to look at the footage of the security camera placed on the side gate. After a while, they came back to the nurse's office and decided to call my parents and the police. The decision was made for my parents to pick me up from school early so the police can come to our house and take a statement, and because I was a hyperventilating wreck. On the car journey home, my mom told me that the teachers had said the camera footage showed him standing at the gate and then sprinting away, which they figured was because I started screaming and crying. She said it was a good thing because I scared him away, but I was bright for my age, and I knew she was saying that only to comfort me. We meet the 2 police officers at our house, 1 female officer, 1 male officer. They are very friendly and make me feel at ease. Whilst they are asking me all of the relevant questions, they then asked me to describe what he looked like. But being so young, I could only say that he was white, tall, with short brown hair. They pressed for more information, such as tattoos. The only thing that come to mind, that he looked like Dan Sullivan from EastEnders. This was met with instant laughter from both police officers and my parents, with the female officer commenting, "Wow, he must be quite good looking." As soon as she said this, my heart sank. After a while, the police had wrapped up the statement and told us to notify them to any more occurrences with this man. I was grateful for their help, but I could not help but feel like I wasn't being taken seriously by the adults. After this, I stopped seeing the guy around town, and the kids on our cul-de-sac say they don't see him either. Life goes on, and gradually, I regained the confidence to play outside again, both with friends and by myself. A year and a half later, I'm 11 years old, and it's the summertime. My parents had gone away on holiday, so my grandma and my aunt were staying at our house, looking after me and my younger sisters for the week. They were a lot more lenient than my parents and would let us play out for longer. And they even let me play over at the tennis court beyond the hedges. It was around 6 p.m. and was still light out, and I was racing my bike up and down the long path situated in the middle of the large field. I had completely worn myself out, and I was on the part of the path where it forks off near the tennis court, so I just sat on my bike for a while trying to catch my breath while watching a group of people further down on the field playing cricket. Next thing I know, I hear somebody quietly but loud enough for me to hear it say, "Hey." I looked around, and I could not see anybody close enough that I would have been able to hear. I then hear a whistle, which leads my eyes directly over to an alleyway sandwiched between the hedgerow and the tennis court, and I recognize it to be the man from when I was younger. The sheer shock of seeing him again completely froze me up. I could not move. He steps out of the alleyway with one hand over his crotch area. He then uses the same hand to gesture me to come over, and it's then that I see the top button of his pants and his fly undone. I accept the very worst is most probably about to happen, and I instantly go into panic mode. I know that I need to get to safety ASAP, and I figured out my options. The first option is to head straight down the field to the group of people playing cricket, but I don't know these people, and I don't know if I can rely on them to keep me safe from this man. My second option is to ride my bike as fast as I can down the path past the tennis court, around the corner, and into my cul-de-sac. However, the man is in the alleyway, and if he ran through it, he would easily beat me to the hedge opening to block my way, or catch me if he wanted. I started pedaling like a madman and decided to head to my cul-de-sac. As I turn the corner, I see that he isn't at the end of the alleyway yet, so I bomb it through the hedge opening. I hear him running and saying, "Just come here." So I race down the pathway and make it to my house. The entire time I'm shouting for my grandma and aunt, and the kids playing out on the grass figuring something is up, and ask what is wrong. I ditch my bike outside my house, go inside and lock the door, and I find my aunt in the kitchen. She's panicked and asked me what's wrong. So I explain everything as fast as I could and say we need to call the police. The next thing I know, I hear the kids outside yelling and screaming "Go away" and calling for their parents. We look outside the kitchen window, and the man is walking past our house looking at me dead in my eyes, completely undeterred by the commotion outside and my aunt standing next to me. He walks out of our line of vision, out of the cul-de-sac and down the road. My aunt tells me to quickly come with her in her car to follow him, so she can at least see if she can follow him to where he lives. I get in the car and sit in the passenger footwell, out of sight. After about 4 minutes of driving, she brakes and asks, "Is that him?" I poke my head up. We are literally outside of one of my best friend's houses. He's standing at an old beaten-up telephone booth that hasn't worked all the time I've known it to be there. He's holding the phone to his ear, but it isn't saying or doing anything. To his right are 3 girls, a little older than I am, sat on a bench chatting away. Oblivious to the man stood silently at a public telephone that doesn't work. My aunt parks her car and says she's going to sit and watch and make sure the girls are okay, and tells me to stay down. After no longer than a minute, my aunt says these girls are getting up, so I poke my head up again, and I see them go on their way. Suddenly the man literally just drops the phone and turns around on the spot to face the girls. Before he can even take a step out of the telephone booth, my aunt starts honking her horn and opening her door to yell at him to go away and leave the girls alone. I see him completely freak out and make a break for it up an alleyway, with which has 2 exits. The girls turn around and try to figure out what's going on, but my aunt pulls away and was headed over to one of the alleyway exits. My aunt tells me to get her phone from her bag to call the police. We get to exit number 1, but he is nowhere to be seen. so we head to exit number 2. Meanwhile, the policewoman on the phone says she is sending for a patrol car to the area and another to our house, so we can give a statement. We get to exit number 2, and again we can't find him anywhere. We decide to head home to meet the police, where I give another statement. The police officers sent this time around take me much more seriously, and after the statement was given, they said they will also spend some time driving around the immediate area looking for the guy. From then on, I did not see the man at all, and nor did my friend. We did not ever receive any type of update from the police, so I never knew what came of the investigation. The situation ended up with me being super protective and paranoid over my younger sisters whenever they were playing outside unsupervised. And I worried that if they were caught up in the same situation, they might not have been as lucky as I am. So scary, weird guy, let's not ever meet again. I used to work at a large department store known for not paying its employees basic minimum wage. I worked in the clothing section with varying hours. Since I was going to school at the time, one evening I had an older gentleman wander through and strike up a conversation. It wasn't unusual to have chatty customers, so I wasn't worried and talked with him as I was working. I wandered around the department, and he stayed still, telling me all sorts of things, how people mistake him for Latino, but he's Portuguese, how he hates the term Latino because no one actually speaks Latin, how he actually works up north for a couple of hours as some kind of doctor, but comes down fairly often for presentations and meetings. He wasn't out of the ordinary, but definitely seemed more like a lonely man who wanted company more than anything. Fast forward maybe 6 months, and he's come in a handful of times since the initial visit, but never overstepped many boundaries until I found out he was asking about me. Not terrible in and of itself if he's looking for a friend to say hi to, except he came in and asked every single employee he could find for me. Luckily, one time I was stuck in the back the whole day, so never ventured onto the sales floor, and the other 2 days I wasn't working. I had multiple people tell me some old dude was looking for you. I also learned he spent several hours in the store just wandering. Fast forward a month or two more, and I got stuck checking customers out at a register. They do it on purpose. Cashiers get paid more, so they take sales associates like me and train us on the cash register, so they pull us off the sales floor whenever it gets crowded at the registers. Instead of paying for another cashier shift, he happens to come in that day, sees me at the register, and waits in line. If anyone has been to any grocery store ever, you'll know that the line gets long. Every single customer in front of him had full shopping carts of items, but he patiently waited. At this point, I was weirded out because he kept asking about me and repeatedly coming in to the store, so I was weary and kept an eye on him. When it's finally his turn, he walks up, thrusts a picked package in my hand, smiles, and walks off. I was so surprised I didn't react quickly enough to reject the gift. Inside was a romantic card, printed translations for all kinds of common phrases, including "I love you," from English to Portuguese, with a note that said, "I can't wait to practice with you," and a $100 gift card for Victoria's Secret. I went to the manager and told her what happened. She took down a description of him and notified security. and told me it was up to me if I wanted to keep the gifts. Coworkers eventually convinced me to keep the gift card, but I chucked everything else. However, I did not use the gift card for more than 3 years because I looked up the fine print and saw that if he knew the card number, he could call and see if it was used. I didn't like the idea of that. When I quit not long after, coworkers kept me updated whenever he wandered into the store looking for me. He did not stop for at least 6 months after I left. I've had many other encounters at work and can share if there's interest. Some are definitely as bad, if not worse, than this. Alright, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead, like, share, subscribe. Thank you for watching.